That's actually a really good point, Mimi. That's a great point. That's a good, right. This is, yeah. It's not that old. But it is. It's the oldest one in Sag Harbor for sure. And it predates us by a couple of decades for sure. Hey, Susan. Yeah, no, we're like, the Episcopal Church I think was a couple of years before us, and the Catholic Church is more recent. The Catholic Church actually is an interesting story because just like it was actually the case for a lot of different scenarios where there, are covenants and things like that that prevented people from selling. Yeah, so the area wasn't exactly very welcoming to the Catholics to begin with. So the way that they bought that property was that like two local people bought it and then immediately turned it over to the diocese. But yeah, actually, right across the street from here, there's that parking lot. St. Andrews is right there. So I assume that St. Andrews has been here, forever. But it turns out actually that yeah, no, no. So right, and Southampton is actually the most complicated of them all. They still have some things that are lingering, that I think are probably not legal anymore, but they're kind of in there. It's yeah, it's I don't know. All that stuff is a bit tricky. All right. No, that's exactly right. Look, I was a kid and I came here a few times when Jan was running things. I only have vague memories. We were only here for one high holidays that I recall, and my dad would come periodically. But they had a house in Bridgehampton for years, but there was only they rented it every summer from Memorial Day basically to Labor Day. So we, growing up, we didn't even know about Adas because exactly when we were here is when the building was closed. Really, right? It was just the things that were going on major holidays and stuff like that. So we did some time at JCOH and we did some time with Jan, and Jan had been a student. I grew up at B'nai Jeshurun in the city, so Jan was a student rabbi there, and learned with Marshall Meyer and all that. So we knew her sort of separately. It's a small rabbinic world. Oh, you're kidding? Well, that's a small world. To share it as it right, exactly. Though that is exactly right. But this space for sure is it's acoustically designed to really carry. So I finally, though, after weeks of thinking that I was maybe just crazy about it, but I finally talked to Pastor Remkes about it. So there is some issue with this audio system where it's set up that it basically, when one person is on this side talking, the other mic shuts off. And I don't know whether it actually works simultaneously or not. So I have to figure out exactly how to work around that challenge. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why it always sounded like there was like a 2 second delay when she finished and I would start, or I would start and she would finish. So it's probably to prevent the system from getting feedback and hearing all sorts of stuff that you're not intended to hear. There's no. We went from 2 cantors last week to no cantors tonight. I am going to be singing the old melodies. As far as my brain will carry, that is exactly what we're going to be. We're going back in time in that way. Actually, the truth is that tonight my dad was supposed to come out and to be our guest chazan with me, but my mom unfortunately tested positive for COVID, so that obviously changed our plans significantly. So, but he is, at least as far as my last conversation with him, I think he's going to teach Torah study tomorrow. So at least that's something. And Lauren couldn't be here tonight, but she's going to be part of services tomorrow morning. So we'd like to keep it convoluted around here as much as we possibly can. But thank you to everybody for coming last week. I think it made Kevin feel very welcome as an initial thing, and Nikki as well. And they're really lovely. We got a chance. Yeah, and we're hoping we can get another opportunity or so, with the two of them together, with Lauren and Kevin together before, But really, I think wedding is next June. What did you say, Sue? So they're not fully ordained. It's funny you bring that up because I take a certain liberty because I find saying student cantor just doesn't feel right. There's something about that just feels off to me. It takes too long, and for all intents and purposes, when our cantors serve in this congregation, they really serve as cantors. It's not to belittle the thing that changes when you're officially ordained, right? There is a legality to all of it and everything, but I think in terms of the honorific of it, in my experience, our student cantors have earned that that particular rite, because a lot of student pulpits for cantors are not like that. If you go, for example, and you end up as a cantor in a congregation that has an existing cantor, you take on a very different kind of role, whereas here, maybe not the first couple of months, but eventually all of our student cantors are at the point where they essentially could lead a service entirely on their own if they needed to. And that's not something that happens by accident. It's really like combination of hard work and, Neil picking the right ones. That's, we have to give the credit where credit is due. But, I think Kevin's going to fit in really well. Also, personality-wise, I think he got us pretty quickly, which was a nice thing. So it was just nice that we had so many people to welcome. And it's nice to see all of you as well. And those that know, I haven't felt so great this week, so I'm a little bit slow. But seeing all of you is definitely inspiring. I feel already a little bit more energy. And so we'll say Shabbat Shalom, and we'll welcome our friends watching at home. And as Mimi says, when I'm all by my lonesome, we go back to the old melodies, the things we know the best. And so, of course, as always, if you know it, even with your mask on, sing along. It always is appreciated. So we'll start with just our opening song. Yallai lai lai la lai lai yallai lai lai la lai lai yallai lai lai la lai 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 ai lai lai la lai lai yallai lai lai la lai lai ai lai lai la lai lai lai. Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom. Yallai lai lai la la lai yallai lai lai la la lai yallai lai lai la lai lai ai lai lai. Ay lai lai la lai lai yallai lai lai la lai lai ay lai lai la lai lai lai. Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom. We'll turn now to page 120 and light and bless our Shabbat candles. Again, page 120. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. We'll turn now to page 130 and begin Kabbalat Shabbat together at the very top of the page. Lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena l'Adonai. Lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena l'Adonai. Naria, naria, letzur yishenu, nekad mafanav betodaham. Naria, naria, letzur yishenu, bizmirot naria lo. Lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena l'Adonai. Lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena, lechu ner hanena l'Adonai. We'll turn now to page 131, Shiru Ladonai, beginning in the middle of the page in Hebrew. Shiru Ladonai, Shiru Shir Chadash, Shiru Ladonai, Kol Haaretz, Shiru Ladonai, Baruchu Shemo, Basru Meyom Leyom Yeshuato, Shiru Ladonai, Baruchu Shemo, Basru meyom leyom Yeshuato. Shiru ladonai, shiru shir chadash, shiru ladonai kol haaretz, shiru ladonai baruchu shemo, Basru meyom leyom Yeshuato. Shiru ladonai baruchu shemo. Basru meyom leyom Yeshuato. We'll turn now to page 132, or Zarua, beginning in the last Hebrew paragraph at the bottom of the page. Or Zarua la tzadik, uleishrei lev simcha. Or Zarua la tzadik, uleishrei lev simcha. Simechu tzadikim b'Adonai, vehodu lezecher kodsho. Simechu tzadikim b'Adonai, vehodu lezecher kodsho. We'll turn now to page 134, at the very top of the page in Hebrew. Zamru ladonai bechinor, bechinor vekol zimra, bachatzotzrot vekol shofar, ahariu lifnei hamelech Adonai. Yiram hayam umlo, tevel veyoshveva, neharot imcha uchaf yachad, harim yiranenu, lifnei Adonai kiva, lishbot haaretz, yishbot tevel betzedek, ve'hamim mesharim. Yiram hayam umlo, tevel veyoshveba, neharot imcha uchaf yachad, harim yiranenu. We're now on page 135, Romamu, which is the Hebrew paragraph towards the middle of the page, last Hebrew paragraph. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehakodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehakodsho. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehakodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu lehakodsho. We'll turn now to page 136, begin at the very top of the page. Mizmor leDavid, havu l'Adonai b'nei Elim, havu l'Adonai kavod va'oz, havu l'Adonai kevod shemo, ishtachavu l'Adonai behadrat kodesh. Kol Adonai al hamayim, el hakavod hirim, Adonai al mayim rabim, Adonai al mayim rabim. Kol Adonai ba'koach, Kol Adonai behadar, Kol Adonai shover harazim, Vaishaber Adonai et arzei halvanon, וירקידם כמו הגל, לבנון וסריון, כמו בן רמים, כמו בן רמים. כל אדוני חוצב להבות אש, כל אדוני יכיל מדבר, יכיל אדוני מדבר קדש, כל אדוני יכול איילות, ויכסוף יערות ובכלו, כולו מכבוד, כולו מכבוד, כולו מכבוד. אדוני למבול ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם. אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו ושלום. We turn to Lachado D on page 138. The reminder we'll do the first, second, fifth, and ninth paragraphs, and for the final paragraph, we'll rise and face towards the rear of the room. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. 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 Shamor וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ותפארת ולתהילה. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha, כי מקור הברכה מראש מקדם נסוכה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תפילה. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Fifth paragraph. Hitoreri, ki ba'orech kumi uri, shir daberi, kevod Adonai alaich nigla. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Boi v'shalom ateret palam, גם בשמחה ובצהלה, תוך אמוני העם סגולה, בואי חלה, בואי חלה. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lechado di likrat kala pnei Shabbat nekabela. Please be seated. We'll turn now to page 140, Tzadik Katamar, just where the Hebrew indents in the middle of the page. Tzadik Katamar Yifrach Keres Bavanon Yizke Shetulim Beveit Adonai Bechatzrot Eloheinu Yafrichu Od Yenuvun Beseva Deshenim Verananim Yehu Lehagin Ki Ashar Adonai Tzurim Velo Avlatabo. Now rise in body or spirit as we turn to page 144 for the Chatzi Kaddish. Yitkadal veyitkadash shemei Rabba be'amad yivrach yirutei be'amlich malchutei b'chayechon u'vyomechon u'b'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'gala u'bizman kariv veimeru Amen. Yesh me Rabba mevarach Le'alam li'almei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha brichu leila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata Damiran behalma v'imeru. Amen. We turn to page 146 for the Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai hamevorach. Baruch Adonai hamevorach leolam va'ed. Please be seated. Let's turn to page 149. We'll read together in English at the top of the page. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, from whom the evening flows. Your wisdom sets the way on which time and season glide. Your breath guides the sail of the stars. Creator of the tide of time and light, you guide the current of day into night. As heaven spans to infinity, you set its course for eternity. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, from whom the evening flows. Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uvelayla, Adonai tzvahot shemo, El chai v'kayam tamidim lochaleinu leolam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai, Amariv haravim. We'll turn now to page 150. We'll read together in English at the bottom of the page. Everlasting love you offered your people Israel by teaching us Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts. Therefore, Adonai our God, when we lie down and when we rise up, we will meditate on your laws and your commandments. We will rejoice in your Torah forever. Day and night we will reflect on them, for they are our life, and doing them lengthens our days. Never remove your love from us. Praise to you, Adonai, who loves your people Israel. Ki ehem chayinu ve'orech yameinu, v'hem negei yomam v'layla, v'avatcha al tasir mimenu li'olamim, Baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Please join me on page 154. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha v'chol nafshecha uv'chol meodecha והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, Adonai Elohechem Emet. We'll turn now to page 157. We'll read together in English at the top of the page. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together. As we turn to page 158, Michamocha at the top of the page. Yabai bye bim 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 bam, yabai bye bim bam, yabai bye bim 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 bam, yabai bye bim bam, yabai ba 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 ba, yabai bye bim bam, yabai ba 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 ba, yabai bye bim bam. Mi chamocha bailim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar bakodesh, Norat hilot osefele, Norat hilot osefele, Yabai bye bim 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 bam, yabai bye bim bam, yabai bye bim 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 bam, yabai bye bim bam, yabai ba 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 ba, yabai bye bim bam, yabai ba 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 ba, yabai bye bim bam. Malchutecha ra'u vanecha, bokeam lifnei Moshe Miriam zeli anu ve'amru, Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed, v'nemar kifad Adonai et Yaakov, ugolo miad chazak mimenu, Baruch atah Adonai, Gal Yisrael. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up, waiting to do your will. We turn to page 160, Hashkivenu at the top of the page. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomereinu lechayim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomereinu lechayim. Ushmor tzeiteinu Uvoeinu lechaim u'shalom me'ata ve'ad olam. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomereinu lechaim. Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Yerushalayim. So we turn to page 162, Veshamru at the very top of the page. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat, Ledorotam berit olam, Einai beini, uvein b'nei Yisrael, oti leolam. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim et haaretz uvayom hashivim Shabbat Shabbat vayi nafash. I'll invite everyone to rise in body or spirit. We'll begin the Amidah together on page 164 and then continue silently from there. As always, please go at your own pace, and if you're standing, you may be seated at the end. Adonai sefatai tiftachu fi yadi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Ose shalom bimromav, uyase shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol Yehoshvei Tevel. Yase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. We'll turn now to page 371 as we offer our Misha Berach this evening. I'll begin by thinking of those in our community and connected to our community who are in need of healing. Tonight we're thinking of Sydney Ross, Roberta Kyle, Rivka Bat Yehuda Vabela, Eve Rose, Mechoil Ben Chananya, David Kyle Klopman, Bentzi Tepper, Samuel Moskowitz, Devorah Batsima, Michael Klinghoffer, Norma Polsak, Amy Cass, Steve Levine, Rivka Bat Rachel, Gail Gambino, Leah Bat Naomi, Gedalia Ben Sylvia, Lorraine Danis, David Dowling, Sivia Devorah Bat Francis, Myra Peskowitz, Martin Stephen Blake, Chaim Leib, Deborah Block Kroll, Sylvia Oren, Michelle Sawicki, Francis Kirschman, Paul Eric Feuden Bat Esther, Shelley Newmark, Diane Axelrod, and Gabriella Rose Spicer. And in addition to the names we read, And of course, still holding in our hearts the people of Ukraine. We'll also offer the opportunity for those at home to share the names of your loved ones, or those on the Zoom to share them there. And for those in the room with us tonight, if you have additional names, we'll start on this side of the room as we do and work towards the back, and then this side of the room and towards the rear. We'll join together now in the middle of page 371, our Misha Berach, our prayer for healing. Misha Berach Avotenu Mekor HaBracha Leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mishe Berach Imotenu Mekor HaBracha Lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So those that were with us last week or watched last week, I gave you the sense that this Shabbat I deferred my comments from last week to give space for Aaron, who gave a beautiful drash. Not an easy thing to do, again, as a student rabbi, to get up in front of a room and to be able to speak the way that he did from the heart. And I thought it was really quite beautiful and quite brilliant. But under normal circumstances, given the news of the week, last week I certainly had some thoughts about the leaked document and the very real possibility of Roe versus Wade being overturned. In some ways, I'm grateful that I had this extra week, because it allowed me a week to ponder some things that actually were leaving me a little, I don't know whether the word is troubled, but unsure exactly how to express specifically what Judaism has to say about this particular topic. And then I found that a lot of what I was reading was what is oftentimes the case, I'm as guilty as the next, of beginning a sentence with Judaism says, and then fill in the blank. So that right off the bat is actually problematic, because Judaism says a lot of things about a lot of things, and some of those things are, I won't necessarily say contradictory, but they change, and their perspective can change, and who is expressing what Judaism says has a lot to do with what the actual outcome is. So I came across what I think is a very important, very nuanced article that expresses some of the challenges of this. It was written by Michal Raucher, who is the Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. And she wrote an article for the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, that's titled, Jewish Tradition, quote, permits abortion. If you believe in bodily autonomy, that's not enough. So what is this about, and why is this relevant? I'll try to express as best as I can through both my own commentary and through her words in this brilliant article. So part of this, and part of my challenge, I think, as a citizen of this country and as a rabbi representing a several thousand-year-old tradition of how to hold these two things kind of in the same place at the same time. And as I said, part of what makes this conversation around abortion so complicated is because of the religious aspect to it. It's part of the conversation, whether we like it or not, in this country, which is theoretically supposed to separate church and state. We know that that's never, or maybe never existed, and certainly these days the line is much more complicated. And in terms of how Judaism fits into it, what really starts to get under my skin a lot more than I ever really used to pay attention to it, is when we are sort of referred to as a Judeo-Christian tradition. Right? We sort of get lumped into a conversation that maybe we don't want to be lumped in with, and maybe we have some different opinions about. And when it's expressed in these sort of simplistic ways, we tend to actually devolve the conversation rather than to treat it with the nuance that I think it oftentimes needs. So Rauscher's commentary and her perspective on this doesn't come from nowhere. The focus of her work has largely to do with this conversation within Judaism, is sort of how does Judaism deal with what we would call bodily autonomy, the ability for people, specifically women in this case, to be able to determine what happens to their own bodies. So part of the really interesting thing here, which I thought of, and very few other people, I think, between last week and this week, I think really went in this direction, but it occurred to me that probably the most interesting place to consider this question is not here, right, but to think about the modern state of Israel. Because if you think about it, where better to get an indication of what it is that Judaism thinks about a complicated subject like abortion than in a place in which there is a marrying of Jewish traditional thought. And if you don't think that Jewish religion, and specifically ultra-Orthodox views on Jewish religion, impact the secular law of the state of Israel, talk to anybody who wants to get married in that country or to convert in that country, and they will tell you the lines are very blurry, to say the very least. And just out of curiosity, if I were polling the room, how many of you think that abortion is legal in Israel? Okay, so Jack says yay, rest of the Ann says yes. Others are skeptical, to say the least. So for those that said yes, the answer is yes. When do you think that came into existence? When do we think? From the beginning of the state, in the last couple of years, if you were just guessing? Very good. Okay, so the 1970s. Oftentimes is the case in Israel, a lot of things dovetail with what's going on here in the States. But it is not by any means since 1948. Okay, it is not part of the founding documents of the country by any means. And to remember again that Israel has a secular government, it has its own Supreme Court, but it also has basically a parallel court. It has a rabbinic court that has a lot of sway, as I said, over things that matter in terms of Jewish law and Jewish practice and life. So interestingly enough, last week there was a comment that wasn't picked up by a lot of places, but it stood out to me, that was made by the Israeli health minister, right? The person in the cabinet who is in charge of matters of health in the current government. His name is Nitzan Horowitz. And his response to this was in a tweet, and he said simply, "A woman's rights over her own body are hers alone." Okay, so this is the head of their, the ministry that is responsible for health, and which this conversation exists. And there is a statement by that person that is unequivocal. But lest we think that that's the case all across the board, of course it's not. So in Rauscher's commentary in her article, she says as follows. It's important to understand what does it look like in Israel. So until the 1970s, right, after a lot of debate, and ultimately it's passed, there is a law in Israel that permits abortion, but under certain circumstances, most of those which will be familiar to us. If a woman is younger than 17 or older than 40, for different kinds of reasons. Older than 40 is more about presenting a potential health challenge to a person. Under 17 has very different connotations. When pregnancy results from rape, incest, or extramarital relations is a second possibility. Third, on the possibility that the baby will be born with a physical or mental deformity that is significant. And four, when the continuation of the pregnancy could endanger the woman's life or mental health. Which is an important distinction there, is not to just say a matter of life and death in the traditional sense, but also in terms of one's ability to function as a human being. And ultimately speaking, this law even allows certain abortions to be performed up until the 39th week of pregnancy. So when she goes on to point out the fact that she teaches this, right, about this to her students at Rutgers, she's often sort of surprised by the response of her students. What she says is, when I teach Americans about abortion law in Israel, they often express shock that Israel seems much more progressive than America on the subject. Why? That's because their frame of reference for religion and abortion is a particular strain of American anti-abortion Christianity. My students, college-aged and adult, Jewish and not, are surprised to see a country that is at least seemingly so strongly influenced by religion, by Judaism, that is not opposed principally to abortion. Yet, she continues, in one important way, the Israeli and American attitudes towards abortion are similar. They both reflect the fundamental assumption that abortion is wrong, and that one must have a quote-unquote good enough reason to do something that is otherwise wrong. So she's already drawing attention to one of the nuances of this conversation, which is to suggest any time that we are putting a limitation of sorts, right? Remember again, try to put yourself into the mindset of a woman coming to sit in front of a board, right? Remember, Israel has a socialized medicine So they're talking about, working within what's called the kuppah, the sort of the medicine that most people in Israel use. They literally have to go in to sit in front of a board, and for that board to hear the details as to why this person is deciding to have an abortion. It's a step beyond. It requires a explanation of sorts. Okay? So in this case, it's very similar to the way that the conversation evolved around Roe versus Wade and still exists to this day, is that even for people for whom the conversation says that abortion should be legal, that there are always various constraints that are put on it in terms of when it should be allowed to happen and under what circumstances. And this, as she explains, is generally understood to be called the justification approach to abortion. Certain abortions are justified while others are not. And the justification approach to abortion also assumes that women were meant to be mothers. As a result, not wanting to be pregnant for 9 months, give birth, or raise a child are not considered good enough reasons ultimately to get an abortion. And in order to qualify for an abortion that is legal and paid for by the state, Israeli women have to sit in front, as I said, of this committee and tell them, and although 98% of the time the requests are approved, okay, so this is, almost a pro forma thing in almost all instances, the law still reflects the belief that women cannot or should not make this decision on their own. Rauscher continues the thought a little bit further. She says, well-meaning Jewish groups often draw on rabbinic sources to claim that Judaism is supportive of abortion rights. And this is what one of my challenges of the last couple of weeks is seeing colleagues of mine, articles that were written, things even I've said that basically say Judaism says X, okay, that Judaism is supportive of abortion rights, and basing that in halakha and Jewish law, of which there is a substantial amount of material that lends credence to exactly that argument, that the rabbis basically determine, especially in a situation in which the mother's life is in risk, that there isn't a question as to whether or not an abortion can take place. And the rabbis even go so far as to say that a fetus is not a living entity until it comes into the world. That their perspective actually from a rabbinic standpoint is that until a child literally is birthed into the world, they are not to be considered as a human being. They have a different status altogether. So rabbinic Judaism for a long time has had this kind of perspective. But again, it ends up in this sort of world of justification, of circumstance, of moments and opportunities in which it makes sense for it to happen and others where it does not. And in the end, this is how it's meted out even today. Representatives ultimately of the Orthodox Union explain that they can't support an absolute ban on abortion because Jewish law requires abortion when carrying the pregnancy to term poses real risk to the life of the mother. But based in that argument is the assumption, right, that in the end, it's not a question of whether the woman has autonomy to make a decision for themselves. It's only whether a certain circumstance, according to Jewish law, would allow for it, which is a very different kind of argument. So when you hear Jewish law permits and sometimes requires abortion, you also have to listen, she says, to the assumption underlying this statement. Women do not have the bodily autonomy to make that decision on their own. Jewish law must permit it and sometimes demands it, regardless of what a woman prefers. These statements, often used to express support for abortion rights, are ultimately stymied by the assumptions of rabbinic law, a system that does not generally support bodily autonomy or the ability to make decisions about one's own body. And she is correct there once again, that if you study the broad approach of halakha, of Jewish law, to the lives and to the bodies of women, there are more examples than not that suggest let's say, a certain amount of control over the ability of women to do whatever it is that they decide to do with their bodies or not. So it's a bit disingenuous for us to present, again, Judaism says X in an unequivocal kind of way when it's really not actually all that accurate. But she drives home this ultimate point. She's not trying to counter the arguments. She's simply saying that we have to understand what is being said and understand the nuance. And she says, unless you support a person's right to bodily autonomy, in other words, the ability, again, to decide what happens to our own bodies, then you are supporting a system wherein somebody else determines what you or anyone else can do with those bodies. It doesn't matter whether that person is a lawmaker, a judge, a contemporary rabbi, or one from 2,000 years ago. It doesn't matter whether that person would permit most abortions or even require some. Why, she says? There's temptation right now to say that restrictions on abortion rights in the United States violate the religious freedom of Jews, and that actually has been the case. Many of the articles that have been written the last few weeks, powerful ones, make exactly that argument. To take away the right, is actually an affront to our religious understanding. And that's true, she says, to an extent. But a religious argument based on Jewish law and rabbinic texts only goes so far. Those of us, speaking for herself, who support reproductive health, rights, and justice ought to be honest about the connection between that and our rabbinic tradition. I believe, she says, in the same bodily autonomy argument that Nitzan Horowitz makes, right, the interior health minister of the state of Israel. It may not be an argument rooted in Jewish law, she says, but it is a Jewish argument, and it's time ultimately to make it. So what does all of this mean, again, in summary? To be very clear, I personally, right, Dan Geffen, who is also a rabbi, I believe in the bodily autonomy of women to decide what it is that they do or do not do. To me, it's an unequivocal consideration. And a lot of my thinking on that is driven by my Jewish values, by my sense of what I believe Judaism at its essence is trying to tell us as responsible human beings and as caring human beings and as compassionate human beings about life and its complexities. But at the same time, as a rabbi who has studied extensively the ways in which our traditions speak about a lot of different subjects, including the ability, again, of women to lead their own lives and to do what they feel they want to do, it would be disingenuous for me to stand up here and say that Judaism across the board believes this. And again, remember that what happened in Israel in the 70s wasn't without debate. And remember that as it exists today is not without debate. The same way that we have a very extreme part of the religious world that lives in this country that are very, very opposed to any form of abortion, the same is true in Israel. If you go to certain communities, they will tell you for very similar kinds of reasons. Not because it's necessarily based in historical precedent within Rabbinic Judaism, but because it fits in with the paradigm of the way that they view all manner of things. And if we're not honest about this conversation, if we can't be acknowledging of the fact that there are things we wish that Judaism may say, or I'm just speaking in the I, right, that I wish that it said for 2,000 years, it hasn't necessarily. But as, Rauscher points out, we can make this a Jewish argument without necessarily basing it exclusively in Jewish historical legal precedent. Because in that space, it is much more complicated, it is much more nuanced, and it's not as unequivocally, let's say, positive in terms of supporting the autonomy of not just women, of men or women, to be able to determine how their bodies are used, what happens to their bodies. And I think that in the end, it is a Jewish conversation, but it's one that we have to, if we're going to have it, and we're going to claim that it's a Jewish conversation, I think we also have to take a certain amount of ownership over the nuance part of it. And even for my colleagues who I love and adore, who came out very strongly last week with very clear indications, Judaism says X or says Y, even if those statements are broadly true, and they are, right? The Jewish law, again, says very clearly, especially if the mother's life is at risk, and even under other circumstances, that it is permissible. It falls short of what I think many of us hope for in terms of the way that this particular conversation is legislated in our country, and quite frankly, probably in all countries. And it really comes down to, again, a belief in the ability for individual women going through the various challenges that are related to carrying, birthing a child, especially one we may find out has either a threat to life or birth defects. But as she points out, there are other circumstances in which a person may realize that if they were to take a child to term, raise that child, and are not prepared for it, the things that can happen to that child as a result of it are quite terrible as well. And it's not a simple conversation for anybody who's ever been involved in it. And to make the conversation simple, I think actually devalues the conversation more than anything else. So I want to be, again, unequivocally clear that Jewish law, Jewish history, Jewish precedent does say very clearly about these issues, what it believes and what we ought to believe or practice. But I think there is a point in which we also have to move beyond just what Judaism says. We have to use a certain amount of what are the value set that we collectively as a community, we as part of Reform Judaism, we as part of Judaism as a whole, how do we respond in these moments? And how do we see, especially when a law that was already existing in the land is to be overturned, we have to be engaged in that conversation. In one form or the other, we have to be engaged in that conversation. And to understand, of course, there are going to be differences of opinion, there are going to be nuances, but I think from my experience, when you're talking about a complicated conversation and you try to make it simple and fit on a bumper sticker, usually more damage is going to be done than good. I think we have to really take responsibility to really, if we're going to call out Judaism in this conversation, let's be knowledgeable about it, let's understand it from every angle, and let's be expressive of the places where we can be supported in our arguments and also be comfortable for those that of us that agree with my position to be comfortable going beyond and to say Judaism may stop here, but I believe we need to go further in this case and to preserve bodily autonomy for all of those that find themselves in a situation where they have to make this kind of really heart-breaking and gut-wrenching kind of decision. So I leave you with that to consider, and my best suggestion is keep reading, right? Read articles that you don't necessarily agree with, and insofar as you are interested in learning more of the actual textual basis for any of this, I'd be more than willing to teach what I do know and to share those experiences as well. So with that, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and we will now turn to page 570 to mark the counting of the Omer. If you so choose, you are welcome to rise. We're on page 570. Unfortunately, I meant to ask Cantor Lauren to make a recording of her beautiful singing rendition of this, but I don't have that skill set. So we'll turn again to page 570, and we can join together in the Hebrew at the very top of the page. Hineni muchan umezuman lekayem mitzvat aseh shel sfirat haomer. Together in Hebrew, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu al sfirat haomer. Hayom shmona ve'esrim yom shehem arba'a shavuot la'omer. Today marks 28 days, which is 4 weeks of the Omer. And we'll remain standing in body or spirit as we turn to page 586, Aleinu l'shabech, at the bottom of the page. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latet gedula leotzer breshit shelo asanu kegoye haratzot velo samanu kemishpechot adama shelo sama chelkenu kahem vegor aleinu kechol hamonham anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech Malchei Hamlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're now on page 591. V'nehemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo I invite mourners and those observing yahrzeit to please remain standing. Everyone else may be seated at this time. We first begin by thinking of those who have passed in our community in recent months. Dr. John Abderkin, Faith Diskin, Linda Donath, Arlene Eber, Jay Fagan, Ellen Frank, Chaim Bear Greenwald, Arthur Grossman, Gerald Hirsch, Mark Joseph, Jane Beard Cass, Gertrude Katz, Deirdre Klein, Helene Krotman, Leo Leibowitz, William Lippman, Audrey Lubo, Sandra Tromberg-Luongo, Morty Lynn, Jerry Monroe, Nancy Nagel, Harry Olstein, Jeannie Rubin, Howard Schreier, David Senf, Anita Sheldon, Alan Silver, Marlise Silverberg, Blanche Sklar, Rita Sandra Snyder, and Matthew Adam Zimmerman. We also mark the yahrzeits that occurred during the last week for William Bennett, Evelyn Block, Irving Cassell, Rose Kopelman, Henry Decker, Evelyn Gelb, Irene Goldman, Larry Haber, Robert Jonas, Irving Kellman, my grandmother Molly Kessler, Harold Clapper, Heather Kotler, Bernard Dove Kriegsman, Morris Chris, Howard Mazel, Harry Oliphant, Dorothy Rach, Carol Reagan, Robert Saltzman, Lillian Saperstein, Jesse Siegel, Pearl Soroka, Martha Spitzer, Amy Stevens, and Martin Weiss. Are there any other names to share this evening that we didn't mention? I'll invite the mourners to join me on page 598. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'li'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, V'yit hadar v'yit ale v'yit halal shemei dekudsha berichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Zichronam livracha, may every one of their memories be for a blessing. Okay, please be seated. Good Shabbos, everybody. Sort of heavy topic. It always ends up being a quiet room, at least here. We don't know what it's like at home, but it's good to see all of you. And just a few announcements. Please join us for Shabbat services on Zoom tomorrow, beginning at 9:30. Torah study will begin on Zoom at 12 o'clock. And again, unless I'm mistaken, the Torah study will be led by my father, Peter Geffen. So if you're a Peter Geffen fan, 12 o'clock tomorrow on Zoom is a good one for you. This week on Monday, Nina Mitzvah is meeting at 11:30. Good. My Heschel class at 12 o'clock. Hebrew School at 3:30, and the Social Justice Committee's virtual meeting at 5. So the only bummer is we were planning to have our big Lag BaOmer, I'd say, adjacent barbecue, and unfortunately the weather looks bad, so Shelley and, Eileen and Ron decided that it's better to just cancel it. But I think, having an outdoor barbecue sounds like a nice idea, so maybe we can find some time to do that sometime over the summer would be very nice. So unfortunately, Monday, don't come to the shul looking for hot dogs and veggie burgers. We won't have them. But I hope that your Lag BaOmer will still be meaningful wherever and whenever you celebrate. But just a reminder, wine tasting at Channing Daughters is still on for May 24th. Also, our film shul course on Steven Spielberg is May 25th. And the first meeting of the summer book group with Ruth Joseph is on May 29th. So that's Memorial Day weekend. Also, a lot of things coming up for the summer, June, July, and August, things to look forward to. And we're hoping within a couple of weeks we'll be able to have, so long as the weather is nice, we'll have services outdoors right on the front lawn there. And again, anybody who wants to continue to watch by stream will be able to do exactly that. But for anybody who wants to come in person, that is very much our intention and our hope. So, everybody pray for good weather over the next few weeks, and I think it'll be nice. Tonight I don't think would have been so great, but we'll get there for sure. Well, actually, I was going to ask because I wasn't feeling so good. This is the first board meeting I've missed in a pretty long time, so I actually don't even know. So let's, rather than speculate, we'll let the announcement come out, I think, early next week as to what decision of time and where it will be and when and all of that. They made the decision. I'm sure that they did, but I don't. 6:30. Okay, good. There, you heard it first. 6:30. Yeah, Marcia. Yes, normally we have a shift at Memorial Day. We've always had that. When I first came here, it was 8 o'clock, and then we've slowly been sort of maneuvering in different directions. So we'll figure out the parking. But thank you for the head. That is good to know. We'll figure that out. Neil, any fun updates from the building this week? That's good. Actually, there were some pretty big things. They dug up the sidewalk, I think, right? Yeah. Wow. All the walls are poured, Richard's saying. That's amazing. It's great. Thank you guys for all your hard work. It's very exciting. Really very exciting. All right, so we're going to conclude our service. I haven't picked out our closing song for tonight, but we'll pick something good. I think we haven't done Shalom Aleichem in a long time, actually. So let's do that. Page 627. You can stand or sit, hug the person next to you, whatever you prefer, but 627, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei HaSharet, Malachei Elyon, Mi Melech Malachei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem leShalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Baruchuni leShalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzedchem leShalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now rise for Kiddush on page 123. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu, v'shabahat kodsho b'ahavahu v'ratzon inchilanu, zikaron lemahaseh v'reishit, Yehoyahom techila lemikrae kodesh, zecher litziat Mitzrayim, Kivahanu v'acharta, ve'otanu kidashta, mikol hamim, ve'shabat kochecha, ve'ahava uratzon hinchaltanu, Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat. Amen. Chaim. Shabbat Shalom. Good Shabbos. Shabbos to our friends watching at home. Good Shabbos to Neil and Andrew. What'd you say? Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Mimi points out, when we do get to the outdoor service, it's a bring your own chair scenario like it was last summer. I know I'll miss the deer. That was the nicest thing, I think. Last year when we had those services outside was the deer. That was a treat. All right. Well, everybody be safe. Don't get sick like me. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. If you're still listening to the stream, this is the rabbi just testing out something. Test 1, 2, 3. הנה אל ישועתי אפתח ולא אבחן.